James had always believed he was a lucky man. He had a good life, a stable job, and a loving wife, Linda. They had been married for almost 10 years, and from the outside, everything seemed perfect. Friends and family often told them they were a great couple. They had a beautiful home, went on vacations, and celebrated every anniversary with joy. James worked hard to give them a comfortable life, and he believed Linda appreciated it. But over the past few months, he started noticing small changes in her behavior. At first, he didn't think much of it. She had become a little distant, but he assumed she was just busy or stressed. She often stayed up late, scrolling through her phone, sometimes whispering while talking to someone. When James asked who it was, she would smile and say, "Oh, just a friend," and change the subject. Then there were other strange things. Linda, who never cared much about finances, suddenly started asking about their savings, insurance policies, and his will. James found it odd, but told himself it was just normal curiosity. Maybe she wanted to be more involved in their future. But deep inside, something didn't feel right. One evening, James came home earlier than expected. As he stepped into the house, he heard Linda talking on the phone. She was speaking in a low voice, almost like she didn't want anyone to hear. He was about to walk in and greet her when he heard something that made him stop. "He has no idea," she said with a little laugh. "Once he's gone, we'll finally have access to the inheritance." James felt his heart stop. His mind raced. Was she talking about me? He stood frozen, unable to believe what he had just heard. Linda's voice was calm, even excited. There was no sadness, no worry, just confidence. He took a step back, careful not to make any noise. He didn't want her to know he had overheard the conversation. His hands felt cold, and his legs felt weak. He had spent 10 years loving this woman, trusting her. Had she been pretending all along? Had she been waiting for the right moment to? He shook his head, refusing to let his mind go there. James needed to think. If he confronted her now, she might lie. She might twist the truth and make him doubt himself. He needed proof. But how could he find out what she was really planning? Then, an idea came to him. A risky, crazy idea. He would pretend to be dead. If she truly had bad intentions, she would reveal them once she thought he was gone. And if he was wrong, if this was all some misunderstanding, he could find a way to fix it. Taking a deep breath, James knew one thing for sure. He couldn't let Linda know he was onto her. Not yet. James couldn't sleep that night. He lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, his mind racing with questions. Was he imagining things? Could he have misunderstood Linda's words? He wanted to believe that, but deep inside, something told him he had heard exactly what he thought. She had mentioned an inheritance. She had said, "Once he's gone." That couldn't be a mistake. The next morning, Linda acted normal, as if nothing had happened. She greeted him with a smile, made him coffee, and even asked about his plans for the day. James watched her closely, trying to see if there was any guilt in her eyes. But she looked as calm as ever. If she was hiding something, she was good at it. Throughout the day, James couldn't focus on work. His mind kept going back to the conversation he had overheard. Who had she been talking to? What exactly was she planning? He wanted to check her phone, but Linda was always careful with it. She never left it lying around, and when she wasn't using it, she kept it in her pocket. That, too, was something new. That evening, James decided to test her. Over dinner, he casually mentioned, "I was thinking about updating my will, just in case. You know, making sure everything is in order." Linda paused for just a second. It was quick, so quick that someone else might not have noticed, but James did. Then she smiled and said, "Oh, that's a good idea. It's always smart to plan ahead." Her voice was steady, but James could see something in her eyes. Interest, curiosity. It wasn't the reaction of a wife who cared deeply about her husband's well-being. It was the reaction of someone who wanted to know more. As the days passed, James continued watching her. He noticed she had more secret phone calls. Sometimes she would step outside or go into another room just to talk. And every time he walked in unexpectedly, she quickly ended the call or changed the topic. One night, James pretended to be asleep while Linda was on her phone. He kept his breathing steady and his eyes closed, but he listened carefully. "Yes, I know," she whispered. "Soon. Just be patient." James felt his stomach tighten. Soon? Soon what? What was she planning? That was the moment he knew he had to go through with his idea. He had to fake his death and see what Linda did next. If she was truly innocent, she would mourn him. But if she had bad intentions, she would reveal them when she thought he was gone. It was risky. It was dangerous. But James had no other choice. Taking a deep breath, he made up his mind. The next step was to figure out how to do it, and he had to do it fast. James knew that faking his own death was not going to be easy. He needed a solid plan, one that would be believable and wouldn't raise suspicion. He couldn't do it alone, so he decided to reach out to the only person he truly trusted, his best friend, Mark. Mark had been his friend since college, someone who had always been there for him. More importantly, Mark was a retired paramedic, which meant he had the knowledge to make James's plan look real. Late one evening, James met Mark at a quiet cafe and told him everything. Linda's strange behavior, the phone calls, and most importantly, the conversation he had overheard. Mark listened carefully, his expression growing serious. "Are you sure about this, James?" he asked. "Faking your death is a huge risk. What if you're wrong?" "I have to know the truth," James said firmly. "If I confront her now, she'll deny everything. But if she thinks I'm gone, she might reveal her real intentions." Mark sighed, then nodded. "All right. If you're sure about this, I'll help you." Together, they came up with a plan. James would fake a sudden medical emergency, a heart attack. Since Mark was a paramedic, he would make it look real. They decided to do it at home, in front of Linda, so she would have no choice but to believe it. Mark would then arrange for James to be declared dead and taken away before anyone could ask too many questions. A few days later, everything was set. That evening, James and Linda sat in the living room watching TV. His heart pounded as he waited for the right moment. Then he suddenly clutched his chest, gasping for breath. His body tensed as he fell off the couch, groaning in pain. "James?" Linda called, startled. When he didn't respond, she rushed to his side, shaking his shoulder. "James, what's wrong?" His breathing became shallow, his eyes rolling back slightly. Linda grabbed her phone, dialing emergency services in a panic. Right on time, Mark arrived, dressed as a medical responder. He checked James's pulse, put on a serious face, and shook his head. "I'm sorry," he said, turning to Linda. "He's gone." Linda covered her mouth with her hands. Her eyes widened, but James noticed something strange. There were no tears. She looked shocked, but not devastated. Mark continued playing his part. "We need to take him now," he told her. "It's standard procedure." Linda nodded slowly, still staring at James's lifeless body. As Mark and his team carried James away, he kept his breathing steady, not daring to move. Once outside, Mark placed him in an ambulance and drove off. Only then did James finally open his eyes. "She didn't even cry," he said quietly. Mark looked at him and nodded. "Now, we wait and see what she does next." James sat in a small, dimly lit motel room, his heart still racing from what had just happened. He had officially died, and now he had to wait. Mark had arranged everything perfectly. The hospital records would show that James had passed away from a sudden heart attack. Linda would now believe she was a widow. The real question was, what would she do next? Mark had set up a small recording device inside the house before they left. It was hidden in a place where Linda wouldn't notice it. If she made any suspicious phone calls or did anything strange, James would hear it. He had to know what was going on in her mind. Was she heartbroken? Or was she relieved? That night, Mark checked the recording and played it for James. The first few minutes were silent, but then Linda's voice came through. She wasn't crying. She wasn't grieving. Instead, she was making a phone call. "He's gone," she said, her voice calm. "Yes, everything went according to plan. We don't have to wait anymore." James's stomach twisted. She didn't sound sad at all. In fact, she sounded happy. Then, a man's voice responded. "Are you sure? No mistakes this time." Mistakes. This time. James's mind raced. What was going on? Linda sighed. "Yes, I'm sure. It's done. Now, we just have to handle the legal stuff, and we'll be free." James clenched his fists. She was already thinking about his inheritance. She had wasted no time. But who was this man? Was he just a friend, or something more? A few hours later, Linda invited the mystery man over. James listened carefully as the door opened, and the man stepped inside. "I still can't believe it," Linda said. "After all these years, we're finally free to be together." James's breath caught in his throat. She wasn't just hiding something. She had been cheating on him. And now, she was celebrating his death with another man. The man chuckled. "Well, it took longer than expected, but at least it's over. No one will suspect a thing." James could barely believe what he was hearing. Not only had Linda betrayed him, but she had been planning this for a long time. And now that she thought he was dead, she didn't even try to hide it. Mark shook his head, anger flashing in his eyes. She didn't just want you gone. She had been waiting for the right moment to do it. James took a deep breath. He had wanted to believe there was some mistake, that maybe he had misunderstood. But now, there was no doubt. Linda had been planning this all along. But she had made one big mistake. James wasn't really dead. And now, he was going to make sure she faced the truth. James sat in silence, his hands clenched into fists. The woman he had loved and trusted for 10 years had been lying to him. She had not only betrayed him, but had planned for his death. And now she was celebrating, thinking she had won. But she had no idea that James was still alive, and watching her every move. Mark placed a comforting hand on James's shoulder. "We have enough proof now," he said. "She wasn't just unfaithful. She was waiting for your death, so she could take everything. But the question is, what do you want to do next?" James took a deep breath. He wanted to rush back, confront her, and let her know he was alive. But he knew that wouldn't be enough. If he truly wanted justice, he had to be smart. He needed more evidence, something strong enough to expose her completely. The next morning, Mark and James checked the recording again. There was more. Linda had called their family lawyer and set up a meeting. "I need to discuss my husband's estate," she had said. "Since he passed, I want to start the process of transferring everything." She wasn't even waiting. James felt his stomach turn. It had barely been a day, and she was already after his money. But what she didn't know was that James had added a special clause to his will years ago, one that could change everything. James had almost forgotten about it, but now it was his best chance. The clause stated that if he passed under sudden or suspicious circumstances, an investigation would be required before any inheritance was released. Linda thought she was getting everything easily, but she was about to face a big problem. That afternoon, James and Mark followed Linda to the lawyer's office. Since James was dead, he couldn't walk in, but Mark had a plan. He would pretend to be an investigator working with the estate, asking routine questions. From the waiting area, James listened through a small device as Mark spoke to the lawyer. "Mrs. Linda, before we move forward, I need to confirm some details," Mark said in a professional tone. Linda sounded impatient. "What details? My husband passed away suddenly. Everything should be simple." The lawyer adjusted his glasses. "Actually, Mr. James had a special clause in his will. Before any assets are transferred, we must rule out any foul play." There was a pause. Linda's voice changed slightly. Foul play. That's ridiculous. He had a heart attack. Mark leaned forward. Yes, but sudden deaths require extra steps. You understand, don't you? James could almost hear the nervousness in her breathing. She hadn't expected this. For the first time, she was losing control. The trap was set. Now, it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. Linda's fingers tightened around the edge of her purse as she forced a smile. Of course, I understand, she said, though her voice was slightly shaky. But this investigation, how long will it take? Mark pretended to think for a moment. Well, that depends. We'll need to check phone records, financial transactions, and speak to a few people. He leaned forward slightly, lowering his voice. Usually, if nothing suspicious is found, it's quick. But if something does seem strange, well, then it could take much longer. Linda's face paled just a little. That's unnecessary, she said quickly. James was a healthy man, but heart attacks can happen suddenly. I don't see why this is needed. The lawyer adjusted his glasses. I understand, Mrs. Linda, but your husband put this clause in his will himself. We must follow his wishes. James, listening from the car outside, smirked. Linda had walked right into the trap. He could hear the growing frustration in her voice. She had thought she would get the money easily, but now she was realizing things wouldn't be so simple. As she left the office, she pulled out her phone and made another call. Mark had planted a second recording device in her bag earlier, so they could hear every word. We have a problem, she whispered urgently. James put a clause in his will. They're investigating. The man on the other end cursed under his breath. That wasn't supposed to happen. What if they find something? Linda sighed. They won't. There's no proof. I just need to act like a grieving widow until they release the money. James shook his head. Even now, she wasn't afraid. She was confident that no one would catch her, but she didn't know that James was still one step ahead. That night, James and Mark reviewed all the evidence they had gathered, recordings of Linda's phone calls, her conversation with the lawyer, and even her meeting with the mystery man. It was enough to prove she had been planning this for a long time. She thinks she's safe, Mark said. She has no idea what's coming. James nodded, his jaw clenched. Tomorrow, we end this. It's time for her to face the truth. The next morning, Linda sat in her living room, sipping coffee when the doorbell rang. She wasn't expecting anyone, but she got up and opened the door. Her breath caught in her throat. James stood there, very much alive, staring right at her. For the first time, Linda looked truly terrified. She stepped back, shaking her head. You're supposed to be dead? James finished for her. He took a step inside, his eyes never leaving hers. Disappointed to see me, Linda. Her face turned pale as she realized her secret was out, and there was no escaping now. Linda stumbled backward, her face turning pale as if she had seen a ghost. Her hands trembled, and for a moment, she looked completely lost. James, how? This isn't possible. James stepped inside, his eyes locked on hers. He had imagined this moment over and over in his head, but now that it was happening, he felt nothing but cold determination. Surprised? He asked, his voice calm but firm. You thought you had everything planned, didn't you? Linda swallowed hard, trying to regain control. I don't understand. The doctor said. James let out a short laugh. The doctor? Oh, do you mean Mark? My best friend. The one who helped me fake my own death. He tilted his head, watching as realization dawned on her face. Yes, Linda. I heard everything. Every phone call. Every secret meeting. Every disgusting word you said after I died. Her lips parted, but no words came out. She was trapped. There was no way to lie her way out of this. Then, suddenly, her expression changed. Her fear turned into something else. Desperation. James, listen to me, she said, forcing a small, nervous smile. You're misunderstanding everything. I was just confused. I didn't mean anything I said. You have to believe me." James narrowed his eyes. "Believe you?" He pulled out his phone and played the recordings. Linda's own voice filled the room. "He's gone. Yes, everything went according to plan. We don't have to wait anymore." Linda's face crumbled as the truth echoed back at her. James took a deep breath, holding back his anger. "So tell me, Linda, was that just a misunderstanding?" She shook her head, stepping closer, her eyes pleading. "James, please. I was pressured. I didn't mean it. I love you." "Stop lying." James cut her off. "You don't love me. You love my money. And the second you thought I was dead, you ran straight into the arms of another man." Linda's face twisted in frustration. "So what now? What do you want?" James crossed his arms. "Oh, don't worry. I don't want anything from you. But the law, they'll want a lot from you." Before she could react, the front door opened again. 2 police officers stepped inside, followed by Mark. Linda spun around, panic flashing in her eyes. "Wait. No. James, you can't do this." James simply looked at her. "You did this to yourself." The officers stepped forward. "Linda Collins, you are under arrest for conspiracy and attempted fraud." Linda screamed in protest as the officers placed handcuffs on her wrists. "James, please. You can't let them do this." James watched as they led her away. He felt no satisfaction, no happiness, just relief. It was finally over. As the police car drove off, Mark clapped a hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing, James." James exhaled deeply. "Yeah. Now I can finally move on." Weeks passed, and the case against Linda slowly unfolded. The police had gathered all the evidence they needed: her conversations, the recordings, and the shady dealings she had tried to cover up. Linda's betrayal had been exposed, and now she was facing serious charges. James, on the other hand, was left to pick up the pieces of his life. It was a strange feeling, knowing that everything he had trusted was a lie. The woman he thought he knew, the woman he had loved for so long, had planned his death all along. But despite everything, James wasn't filled with anger anymore. It had been replaced with a sense of clarity. He didn't want revenge. He wanted peace. He wanted to heal. Mark had been there for him every step of the way. It was his best friend who had helped James when he was at his lowest, who had helped him escape a dangerous situation, and who had stood by him in the aftermath. James couldn't thank him enough. The first thing James did after the case was over was take some time for himself. He went on a short trip to clear his mind, away from the memories of betrayal. He spent days hiking in the mountains, finding solace in the quiet of nature. It was a much-needed break. During that time, James also started reflecting on the good moments of his life, the ones that weren't overshadowed by lies and deceit. He remembered the times when he and Linda had shared laughs, when they had made plans for their future. Though it hurt, he realized that not everything had been fake. He had loved her, and for a while, that love had been real. But the truth had come out, and now it was time for him to move forward. When James returned home, he made some changes. He decided to leave the house they had shared. It was too filled with memories of her and the lies she had told. He sold the house and moved into a small apartment. It wasn't much, but it felt like a fresh start. Mark helped him through it all, as he always had. But now, James was different, stronger, more aware of the world around him. One evening, James sat alone on the balcony of his new apartment, watching the sunset. He had been through so much, but he had come out the other side a changed man. He knew that life wasn't always easy, but it was always worth fighting for. He had learned that the people you trust can sometimes disappoint you. But you also learn that you are stronger than you think. You can rebuild your life, even when it seems like it's been shattered. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, James realized that he was finally at peace. He had faced the truth, and now he was ready for whatever the future held.